Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Friday, December 13th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So, Tom, welcome back to the program. We missed you.
You did? Well, that's nice to know.
Did.
Yeah, it was. I flew down to Arizona to surprise my father for his 80th birthday.
Wow!
And he was surprised. So it was nice, and I got
it's a noble cause, Tom.
I came back feeling like a pretty good son. So I made the effort, and it was really great though.
And you got in some golf?
Got in a little golf, well, that's the thing. So my dad and I, that's our deal. We play golf. He's, as I said, he turned 80. He still plays 3 days a week. Still pretty good golfer. And we play for this $1 bill, and we started playing for it about, I think 5-7 years ago or something. We had a putting contest, and I won $1 off of him. And so I took it and I folded it up and I put it in my wallet. And now we used to play for, a little bit of money here or there. Now we just play for the $1 bill. It's the most important, the most expensive $1 bill in human history. You would not believe the amount of effort that goes into winning this $1 bill. And I did take it from him.
You took it from your
well, I won it. I won it,
birthday?
So I had to take it. So I am in possession now of the $1 bill until the next time we get a chance to play golf.
Well, that's good to hear.
Andy, weren't those the Stakes and Trading Places, that movie with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy?
Right. Yeah.
That's right.
So guys, let's dive into it. Time Magazine named Trump its Person of the Year, saying his political rebirth is, quote, unparalleled in American history. So, Tom, leaving aside the question of whether anyone under 30 even knows what Time Magazine is, what do you make of the pick?
It's funny. Earlier today, Trump posted on Truth Social one of those memes that said how it started and how it's going. How it started was a picture of his mugshot. How it's going is a picture of him on the cover of Time Magazine as the Person of the Year. So sort of getting a good laugh out of that. Look, I'm not sure. This used to be a much more important and sort of prestigious award when Time Magazine was at its height and in its heyday. Now it's a little bit sort of okay, whatever. But it is, there's a discussion around it every year and who it should be, and there's a short list of folks. And look, certainly Donald Trump is probably the most influential, important person of the last year. You could argue maybe even of the last decade in terms of his influence on our politics, on our culture, on all of these different things. And it is, it is true. It's been a remarkable resurgence and comeback, whatever you want to call it. This guy, after he lost in 2020, was written off January 6th. And he'll never get anywhere near the White House. And he just kept on going. If there's one trait that sort of exemplifies Donald Trump, is this idea that he will never stop. He will never quit. He's going to keep going no matter what people tell him, what the media says about him, what his enemies try and do to him. He keeps chugging along. And in this instance, he came out on top.
Carl, what do you make of the pick?
Well, it was an obvious choice, but you made the in your intro, Andy. Time Magazine, people used to wait around, and there would be like people have parties like the Academy Awards. Who's it going to be? And Time Magazine, I don't know, 5-6 million magazines they sold every week in a country half this size.
It used to be the Man of the Year. Remember that?
Yeah, that's right. And every magazine would be read by 10 people. And now it comes. People say, "Oh, Time Magazine's still in business." That's really. I'm glad to know that, because
isn't that quaint?
Yeah, I don't mean that, but it's nice when media companies are able to keep in business. At least for me, this old ink stained wretch. But I think what Tom's talking about, Andy, and I know you feel the same way. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, and whether you voted for him or didn't vote for him, his resilience is pretty astonishing, and it's a quality that he admires. Do you guys remember in 2016? The press was already sort of struggling to maintain itself in the face of the Trump onslaught. The best question that year in the debates was asked by a civilian in one of these town halls, and he said, what's name? The thing was so vitriolic. He said, say something about the other person that you admire. Hillary Clinton couldn't quite pull it off. She wanted to say he was a good father, but she faltered in mid-sentence. He's kind of attacked Trump. But Trump actually rose to the occasion. He said, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he admired her resilience. He's, said Hillary Clinton could take a punch. That's clearly a trait he respects. And I think this underscores that he's the same way. He's taken a lot of stuff that's come at him. He hasn't given up. And again, like him, love him, hate him, whatever you think. The guy has staying power.
Yeah, well, I read the whole piece because I was someplace where I had nothing to do for a while, so I actually read all.
Oh, you must have been in a doctor's office.
I might have been in a doctor's office, but the line that struck me was this one. It was said, while Democrats estimated that most of the country wanted a president who would uphold the norms of liberal democracy, Trump saw a nation ready to smash them, tapping into a growing sense that the system was rigged. Tom, some people think that maybe it was the Democrats who were fooling around with norms.
Well, certainly. I mean, it's one of those things that the Democrats, everything they accused Donald Trump of doing, they ended up doing themselves in a lot of instances, almost every instance. And it is true, though, that he was a political outsider. That was part of his appeal in 2016. Even after being in office for 4 years and then being out of office, he was able to still sell that idea that the system is rigged, the swamp needs draining, and he's the guy who could do it. And I think that's clearly, when you look at the exit polling data, that's one of the reasons that he won. It's one part of his appeal. It has been ever since he came on the stage, or even before that. I mean, this is a theme of his that he's been talking about going back decades. And so I think a combination of those two things, him being the outsider and him being the recipient of a lot of the these attacks, whether they were the lawfare and the weaponization of the justice system against him, again, which clearly backfired. I mean, he ended up exemplifying that idea that and taking control of that anger that clearly the electorate has felt for a long time and felt again this year.
Yeah. Well, Carl, another thing about the article, they sort of make a big deal of reporting from Mar-a-Lago right now, and you get this sort of picture of Trump that he's a little more restrained now, a little more subdued. They say he seems a little older than the last time they spoke to him, whenever that was. And I wonder if that is helping Trump right now, that he's not sort of out there throwing bombs. He's, a lot of bombs are being thrown. If you look at these nominations, at least people are.
I was going to say, Andy,
about that.
Picking Kerry Lake over to replace Mike Abramowitz is that's a stink bomb.
Right, but Trump himself seems to be a little bit more laid back and maybe a little bit more of what Time Magazine would consider presidential.
Well, there's two things. Yeah, that's an interesting observation, Andy. You think about it. He's 8 years older, right? Yeah. When he came on the scene, he was 70. That was still old for a president. We'd only had one president older, Ronald Reagan. But he's 8 years older. But I think it's more than that. He knows the job now. He ran for this office the first time. Almost seems like half of it was a lark. He wanted to get in, maybe take over Fox News, or maybe get a cable show, or more ambitious than that, start his own network. There were these theories about why he was running, but he's a very competitive guy. And once he was in the primaries, the Republican primaries, he wanted to win, and he did win. And then once in a general election, he kind of wanted to win, and he did. But he didn't know anything about the job he was seeking. He boasted about never having read a presidential biography. Now, none of these birds read as much as they claim they read, but nobody ever bragged about never once reading a book before. That's this guy. And so he didn't really know much. I have a friend who covers the White House. He was convinced that Trump thought the trade deficit was something at the end of the year, one country wrote each other a check. That may be an exaggeration, but there was fundamental things he didn't know about how legislation made, the deals you have to make in Washington. And some of it was he didn't want to do those deals. He was, as Tom said, he was a disruptor. He thought the system was rigged. He thought both parties rigged the system. But my point is that he knows this job now. He's had it, and he knows more. And so when that interview with Kristen Welker, that was the other thing. We talked about that yesterday. He just came across as a guy, more, can I say the word presidential? Is that allowed?
Yeah, you can. You can. Coming out of Carl's mouth, that's pretty interesting. Tom, what do you make of the transition so far? We got about a minute left here.
Yeah, I mean, he has picked people that have been sort of out of the box and surprising in some respects, good and bad. But overall, I mean, the thing that struck me about the transition is just how fast he and his team have moved, and how quickly the world has moved to him, and he's effectively functioning as president right now, which is astonishing. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that before. Peggy Noonan wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal this morning. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. We've never seen anything like this, and
you don't remember Grover Cleveland,
another,
obviously.
well, we've still got another month and a half left until he's officially becomes the president of the United States. Well, for all intents and purposes, he's that now.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm back with the great Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. We're going to take a break and return right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. And Tom, we have this Department of Justice Inspector General report about the FBI's role in January 6th. It's a pretty interesting report. Some conflicting coverage, though. This struck me. Here are two headlines. The PBS headline reads, "No undercover FBI agents at January 6th riot. Watchdog finds in rebuke to conspiracy theories." Washington Examiner. Watchdog reveals FBI had 26 confidential sources in D.C. during January 6th. So, Tom, who's right and what actually happened?
Well, I guess technically they're both right. I mean, I think the reason that conservatives look at this story and see it as somewhat of a bombshell, and see this report as somewhat of a bombshell, is you've had many folks, including the FBI director himself, testify before Congress and basically say there were no undercover agents there. He was asked if there were confidential human sources in the crowd, and he said that, I believe he said there weren't any, and sort of refused to answer the question multiple times. And lo and behold, it turns out, yes, there were more than 24. According to the New York Times story that I read, 3 of those were there at the direction of the FBI. The other ones were there sort of their own volition, is how they reported it. But they also, they meaning the New York Times, focused on the idea that there were no undercover agents. So we're into a semantics game now. And then also that the folks who were there were not directed by the FBI. This is the New York Times reporting. They were not directed by the FBI to engage or encourage any sort of illegal or violent behavior. And obviously, you go back to the story of Ray Epps wanting everybody, the day before, telling everybody they need to get inside the Capitol and urging people. And that bred suspicion that there were, more people like that around that were part of, an FBI operation that tried to encourage folks to and make January 6th more than it otherwise would have been. So I suppose folks on the left will read this and the New York Times story or the Washington Post story, and it'll confirm their priors, just as the folks on the right, it'll confirm their priors, and nobody's minds are going to be changed about what happened on January 6th. Let's put it that way.
Well, Carl, how would you have written that headline? And what do you think is the real story here? I mean, what's the important story, I guess?
Well, we don't know for sure because we don't know exactly what those 24 confidential human informants. What's the nomenclature of the FBI?
CHS, confidential human source. Yeah,
yeah. What they were doing. Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General who conducted the report, was trying to find out if the FBI was directing them to break the law and basically causing the riot. He didn't find that. So that's reassuring that this wasn't an FBI riot,
like the Michigan case.
Kidnapping. Yeah, that's right. That's right. But the other part of it is that, he was very critical of the Bureau for how it dealt with these people. The 55 field offices didn't share their concerns that they were getting from these informants, you know, with headquarters. And the whole thing, it reminded me when I was a young police reporter in these big city police departments, the homicide detectives and the hardened local cops, they had a nickname for the FBI. It was famous but incompetent. And that's kind of, this is harks back to that era, is that they didn't know what they're doing. And Horowitz was not, he doesn't think they staged the riot, but he hardly was complimentary of the Bureau. It's a blistering critique of that agency. And it reminds me of some of the reporting Susan Crabtree's done on the Secret Service agent, that you had, this agency's become, first of all, primarily a domestic spying agency. That's not what it should be. And secondly, not very good at what it does. So you can look at this, and if you're a Democrat, you can be happy that, okay, our side this wasn't a fake, we didn't do this. The other side really rioted. But if you're a Republican, you're looking at this and saying, what's the FBI up to? Why isn't it better at its job? Why did this thing get so out of hand? But I'm with Tom. I don't. The disconcerting thing to me is that the news media goes to its corners, and it kind of reflects the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I didn't see a good explainer. I guess I've heard one now from us, but I didn't see a good explainer that, took into account the various political winds and approached it in a neutral way. It's early, this thing just came out, but I'm hopeful the media can do better with this story, because it's not a flattering picture of the FBI, even if they're exonerated from their worst suspicions.
Yeah, polls show that 25% of Americans now think it's probably or definitely true that the FBI instigated the riot. So that's.
Are those the same people who think we faked the moon landing, or is it a different cohort?
We've had this conversation before about how many Americans believe in Elvis or ghosts or ESP or whatever. We're going to talk about drones in a second, but that struck me as pretty high, that 25% of Americans would think that. And I don't think this report, to tell you the truth, does a whole lot to dispel you from that view if you're predisposed to that. I mean,
totally.
There were 26, the way I understand, there were 26 FBI folks, not folks,
informants, paid informants
there. 3 of them entered the Capitol. 11 entered the grounds. None of them were charged. And 3 more of the 26 were directed to be there. So they were. And then the surprising thing about it to me was that it sounded like they had to do a census afterwards to figure out, almost sort of put a call out, hey, who was there? Because they couldn't give an accurate number. It wasn't that they were assigned to that. They sort of showed up of their own volition. And that seems odd to me as well.
Well, Andy, let me see another question. I ask both of you, Tom. Why am I only finding this out 4 years later? 4.5 years later, almost 5 years later. Right? Wait a minute. 4 years later. Yeah. What's with that?
Why does it take so long, Tom?
Yeah.
You should know.
I don't know. Look, I think this is not a report that the government wanted to write and wanted to put out. So I think that's why it took. I mean, obviously the Bureau and the department have the resources. If they wanted to get some answers quickly, they could do that. They could have done this report in 6 months or 9 months or a year. Instead, it takes 4 years. I don't even know when it was officially started. So how long it actually took from start to finish?
It should have been part of the 9/11, the January 6th report. Congress should have insisted on this.
Yeah.
And what this underscores is that these investigations were partisan, and that's part of the problem. That's one of the reasons people, a high percentage of people, think it's a hoax. What Andy said, think the FBI did it, because they just haven't been transparent. Nancy Pelosi should have convened a blue ribbon panel of people who really want to just get the truth, not make Donald Trump look bad. In my estimation, he would have looked bad, but they should have gone after all of this information. This should have been part of the original, in my mind, the original investigation.
Yeah.
Instead, they hired a TV producer and put on a show where they actually hid evidence from the American people
Well, and Nancy Pelosi barred, she would only take never Trumpers in the Republican Party
Exactly.
on our committee. I think that's the original sin there. It should have been a bipartisan.
But back to your original question, Andy, I do think that this report, for the people who are already predisposed to believe that, and again, we were told by the FBI director himself and others that, oh, clearly this is just a conspiracy theory. There were no FBI agents. There were no confidential human sources. These were all, Trump folks. And turns out, I mean, in some ways, this has been the classic story of the government and the media. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Oh, it happened, but it's not what you think happened, right? I mean, here we are. That's where we are now. And maybe 6 months from now, we'll learn that actually maybe some of those 24 people who were there actually did encourage violence, or did, somehow encourage. I don't know that just because Michael Horowitz didn't find evidence, that doesn't mean that evidence doesn't exist necessarily. So
Tom's one of the 25%, Andy.
Well, no, but I think the fact that the 3 of them
25%er.
entered the Capitol that we know of, and that 11 more entered the grounds, that's 14 people. That's not, it's not impossible to think that some of those were maybe, among the early people who entered the grounds. We don't know the answer to that
Andy's
question.
25% or two. We got,
Yeah.
we're 2/3 of this podcast.
Yeah, and we're 67% of
this podcast.
Let's do a show on the moon landing next week.
All right. Well, hey,
my gripe is more with the media and the coverage of it, and in my opinion, the FBI's cover up of it. Right?
Yeah.
Are you telling me they didn't know this 2 years ago or 3 years ago when they were asked about it? Christopher Wray went to a committee to brief Congress and didn't know these numbers, didn't know that there were confidential human sources.
You know what? Look, it's a big organization. I think it's 7,000 employees, but it seems to me you put out a directive to national headquarters and all of the 55 field officers, say, how many informants did you have there? You get that answer back in a matter of hours, it would seem to me.
Yeah. Well, guys, we're going to have to take a quick break here. We're going to be back in just a minute. I'm Andy Walworth. I'm talking with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. Don't go away. Real Clear Politics will return on Sirius XM after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl Cannon and Tom Bevan. And so, Carl, Janet Yellen now seems to have woken up and is concerned about the debt. She told the Wall Street Journal CEO Council Summit, quote, "I am concerned about fiscal sustainability, and I am sorry we haven't made more progress. I believe the deficit needs to be brought down." So I checked back in September of 2023. National debt was close to $33 trillion at the time. And at that point, she told CNBC she wasn't worried about the debt, saying it was a reasonable level. And what she cared about was this, the net interest as a share of GDP, which she said was under 2%. Yeah. So now we're at a debt of $36 trillion, and she's worried. What do you make of the change of heart?
She set a land speed record for situational ethics. And I have to applaud it. No sense of irony. Just, when and both parties do this. The Republicans do this too. They spend all the money George W. Bush asked them to spend, then suddenly, when Barack Obama's president, they're fiscal hawks overnight. But it's a tiresome act. And this idea that we spend as much money servicing the federal debt as we do on the Pentagon, that should alarm every American. It's just not sustainable. And everyone knows it. The latest gimmick, what is it? Remember, we had the line item veto that passed. Right. Clinton was president, signed it. The Supreme Court, threw it out. They said Congress actually can't just hand the spending power to the president because it's unconstitutional. And, Congress' attitude was they have the stop me before I kill again mentality. And the Supreme Court said no. And they've been unable to deal with it. They blame the presidents, but it's Congress that does it. Well, and then there's these shutdowns every once in a while, and the president always blames the Congress for trying to be fiscally sane for 2 weeks. So it's just the latest gambit is, how about a constitutional amendment force us to balance the budget? That's actually an interesting idea. Most of the states have it, and they balance their budgets. But what you'd think is that these people wouldn't be so craven and they'd be able to do what they were elected to do and what they know is the right thing to do for the country. But alas.
Well, yeah. So, well, Tom, this was going around Twitter, of course, that turns out $8.2 trillion of debt was created when Janet Yellen was the Fed chair or vice chair. Another $8.5 trillion when she was Treasury Secretary. So that's about 46% of the total debt.
It's half of it, yeah.
Right? It's a lot of money. Inflation does seem to be coming back. I mean,
6%
it's sort of odd to
national
hear
debt,
all of a sudden say, oh, sorry, guys, I should have done more.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was pathetic. And to be fair, both sides do it. I'm going to both sides this thing. And
Right.
Unfortunately, it is a huge problem, but our government doesn't care, nor do our candidates. It was not a big part of the discussion of the 2024 election, or the 2020 election for that matter, or the 2016 election. I mean, this is just not something that everybody says they care about, the debt and the deficit. And then, when you try and cut the debt or the deficit, all hell breaks loose because, you're going to take somebody's goodies away, and that just simply can't happen. And so, and the public, by the way, doesn't like it when people take their goodies away. I mean, they like it in theory if it's somebody else's or it's, not coming out of their pocket. But if it's, even means testing Social Security or doing any of these things to try and get some of these federal programs under control, the ones that we actually have some control over, the public goes up in arms about it. So, I mean, I don't know. But again, to Carl's point, I mean, this was rather, you can be sort of savvy about your hypocrisy, or you can just kind of be pathetic about it. And I think Janet Yellen in this instance, a month after the election, she's like, I'm really sorry. I wish we had done more, and we couldn't get more.
Think for a second, though, you guys, about the media's role in this, because Tom said voters don't care. Well, partly they don't care because they're not informed about it in a rational way. If there's anything ever comes up, somebody proposes, we're going to cut Amtrak subsidy, we're going to slow down the cost of living increase, the rate of the COLAs for Social Security. What the media does is call up a lobbyist here in Washington who's paid to represent a group, who's paid to represent that group, and to say, isn't this terrible? And they go, yeah, it's terrible. And we write this headline, it's terrible. Seniors will be harmed. Homeless people, poor people having to take Amtrak will be screwed once again. We just, we kind of search for the people who have a paid interest in not having rational policy. And I think they're always surprised by how much ink we give them.
Wait till you see the headlines when Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy start trying to, take an axe to the federal bureaucracy.
Yeah. Well, we got, I do want to talk about the drones. I've been holding off. These sightings over New Jersey, they're spreading. They've been sighted now in New York, Pennsylvania, and in my home state of Maryland.
Is this War of the Worlds thing, or are they real?
Well,
because War of the Worlds was in New Jersey.
This was the aspect that caught my former Republican governor, Larry Hogan, and I've got a soft spot in my heart for Larry Hogan. He posted on Friday that he personally witnessed, quote, dozens of large drones over his home. And he added that neither the White House, the military, the FBI, or Homeland Security have any idea what they are, where they come from, or who has launched or controlled them, or that they pose no threat.
Jimmy Carter once said he saw a UFO. I love Larry Hogan, but
Larry Hogan's not alone in seeing these things, man.
Where are they coming from?
I was on earlier today. Excuse me. I saw Andy Kim had went out last night and videotaped a bunch of them. He and some of the folks from his office were just sitting there, and videotaping. You could see clearly that what they were talking about. I mean, it is a little disturbing and it's frightening. And this is one of the things, like, hey, if you want to get people's attention, give them a War of the Worlds type scenario or whatever. But again, our government, I mean, if they can't tell us where they're from, who's flying them, what's going on, how can they assure us they don't represent a public threat?
Why doesn't some good old boy in Deer Hunter country go shoot one down with a 30-06 and then we can see what it is? Andy?
Well, that's why they're not flying him over Kent Island, I can tell you, because if you flew one of those over Kent Island.
I predicted the next 24 to 48 hours, someone's going to shoot one of these guys down. Absolutely. I mean, it's now reached the point where, there's enough of them, and there are enough sightings, there's enough sort of outrage and discomfort about it, that whoever does that will be maybe they'll get prosecuted, but they'll also become a folk hero.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that it's kind of amazing. I mean, it makes me think about the Biden White House and whether there's anyone working there anymore, because this is the kind of story that like every American understands exactly what's going on. Now they've seen the pictures, and the fact that they sort of don't have a good answer as to what they are, or even a plan.
Yeah, don't
get the
seem
feeling
particularly interested in finding out.
Yeah,
I mean, the lack of urgency and curiosity about this stuff is on behalf of the media and also these governments, local governments, state governments, federal government is inexplicable.
Oh, I think the media is interested. I will say, I give them the media.
The Air Force has to be. The Air Force has to be doing something. Come on.
We say that.
Then tell us. I mean, why would they not come out and say that's what this is? These are training exercises. These are, we're testing out new drones, whatever. Right. I mean, at least provide some sort of response, some sort of answer, preferably a truthful one. But, I don't know that we can count on the government for that either.
Yeah, we'll be back here on Monday. We'll by then, hopefully, we'll have some answers. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. We're going to take a break. When I come back, I'm going to talk to my friend Charlie Tidmarsh. He writes the This Week in Censorship column for RCP. Fascinating guy. We're going to talk in a minute. So don't go away. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and it's Friday, so a good time to check in with RCP's own Charlie Tidmarsh. Charlie writes a regular column for RCP called This Week in Censorship, where he keeps a close eye on the relationship between government and the press. So, Charlie, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back. Thank you.
So we've talked before about the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. It was set up with the mission of fighting disinformation, but it's now officially being shut down. What happened?
Yeah, so we spoke last time I was on. I think there's been some speculation since the election about the fate of the Global Engagement Center, which is sort of an agency within the State Department. It's been around for about 8 years. It was launched in 2016. And, we were, when I was last on, we were speculating that it might lose its extension. It had an 8-year charter, and that was obviously up for renewal this year. And yeah, we've just got confirmation this week that, its extension would have been written into the National Defense Authorization Act for 2025, and it will no longer continue on into the second Trump term. So it's quite interesting. The State Department officially confirmed that earlier this week, and they've confirmed that some of the personnel and resources will be sort of reassigned to other bureaus in the federal government that monitor foreign intelligence operations. But as you know, and as we've talked about, the Global Engagement Center is a sort of a lightning rod for a lot of people in the last couple of years, concerned with domestic activities of censorship.
Tell us about that. Where did it go astray in your view?
Yeah, well, I think the Global Engagement Center was founded and launched with a mandate, as you said, to monitor foreign influence and intelligence operations, propaganda operations in Asia and Russia and China. And that was, a pretty uncontroversial and supported bipartisan effort. But it's gone astray in the last couple of years, in part to some fantastic reporting by a collection of different reporters who were suspicious of how the Global Engagement Center has turned its attention to domestic actors, journalists, and even congresspeople. And I think the most significant finding in recent years was that the Global Engagement Center has funded, in significant part, a British nonprofit, or I guess you could call it an NGO, called the Global Disinformation Index, which has come up many times as I've been here with you. Yeah. Which is essentially it's a nonprofit committed to, people use different words for this. Conservatives like to say blacklisting, other people like to say media monitoring, but it's a media monitoring monitoring tool that supplies advertising companies and brokerages with lists. They call them dynamic exclusion lists of outlets online that might be compromised by misinformation or even foreign influence and foreign propaganda, so that advertisers can sort of consciously steer their money away from those websites and stifle them and sort of suffocate them out of significant revenue. So that is uncontroversial now. We know that that's how the GDI operates, and we also know that the Global Engagement Center, which is an organ of the State Department, funded this work. And we know that the GDI, the Global Disinformation Index, lists dozens of American media properties as being compromised by either foreign influence or just mis or disinformation, and systematically tries to strip them of their advertising revenue.
Yeah. So and these tend to be, of course, on the right, or
absolutely,
right,
yes.
Right? I mean, that's basically the argument. So the State Department said, as you mentioned, that it plans to move the center's staff and funding to other bureaus aimed at fighting foreign disinformation. So is this really a victory for those who oppose the center, or is it just part of the Washington shell game where the personnel remain in place, the function continues, even if the center itself has ceased to exist?
It's a really good question. It's something I certainly have been thinking a lot about, and it's something that we touched on last time I was on the show, because I came on, I think just days after Marco Rubio got the Secretary of State nomination, and the question is, the question for me was is someone who, at least historically, is sort of hawkish on foreign policy and certainly certainly in China and China's foreign influence operations, going to be comfortable with completely shuttering, on some accounts, a historically quite successful and functional agency when it comes to foreign intelligence operations. So I don't know yet. I hope, and I think most people hope, that these resources can be sort of adequately diverted into the original founding mission of the Global Engagement Center, which is to counter foreign influence. And it remains to be seen. But the problem with the foreign influence sort of mission statement is that it was very insidiously manipulated when certain personnel at these agencies decided to focus their attention on domestic actors, right? Because what ended up happening is, like, Congress people like Jim Banks and even journalists like Matt Taibbi and Gabe Kaminsky did a lot of work on this, where when they were suspected of peddling disinformation, the State Department was able to label them as in internal memos as potentially being conduits of Russian influence. And just by doing that, essentially without any evidence at all, they're able to remain within their mandate of countering foreign influence. But in almost every case, that those allegations have been false. And so you're right. It's a very good question. We have to keep paying attention to it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Jay Bhattacharya. He's the Trump's head to pick the NIH. He was at the center of the Twitter file scandal, of course. What do you make of his ascension to the top job at NIH?
It's been amazing to watch. It's quite a turn of events. Certainly we've talked about Bhattacharya on the show before, and I think, in another world, he might have been the most controversial appointment, but he seems to be among the least controversial appointments.
You're right. They keep hitting us with new ones every day. So
yes, it's a barrage, and it's hard to stay abreast of it all. But he is a hugely, or at least was a hugely controversial figure during the pandemic, and that controversy, frankly, was generated by the agency that he will now direct, by the National Institutes of Health. By its former director, Francis Collins. I think Francis Collins certainly played a role in what certain listeners might now associate with Jay Bhattacharya, which are certain buzzwords like fringe epidemiologist, or right, swift and devastating takedown, or herd immunity. There are all these buzzwords that have been thrown out about his sort of health policy views. And a lot of them are misrepresentations or inaccurate, but the real meat of the issue is that Jay Bhattacharya was the victim of, we'll say, censorship in one form or another. There's, he was certainly he was put on something called a trends blacklist on Twitter in 2020 as a result of his sort of opinions on COVID lockdowns in the early days. Of course, he's the co-author of something called the Great Barrington Declaration, which argued for more focused public health protections for the most vulnerable people. And he really ran the gamut with both sort of directed censorship campaigns against him by these social media platforms, who we now know were in regular communication with the federal government, with the CDC, even with the White House and the FBI. And there was, of course, a Supreme Court case about this, and called Murthy v. Missouri. So he was smeared by the NIH under Francis Collins, and smeared by Anthony Fauci as a fringe epidemiologist. And then sort of downstream of all of that has been routinely and continues to be routinely maligned by mainstream media. But the fact is that he's an eminently qualified, both an MD and a PhD in economics. And I think that there needs to be some introspection over how false statements attributed to him have been sort of parroted.
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned that he's been very controversial. Francis Collins, who was his predecessor, was very concerned about the Barrington Declaration. Wrote to Anthony Fauci at the time, and the quote was from the email, "There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway?" Which led a lot of people to believe, or to think that, well, this is the smoking gun. Mm-hmm. But as you say, he's so eminently qualified, and in person, I've met him and had a chance to interview him. He's one of the most mild-mannered and nice guys you want to meet, as is Francis Collins, by the way, another guy.
Yes.
I've interviewed a couple times, and they're terrific people.
And they're both men of faith as well.
Yeah, and they're both men of faith, and it's kind of interesting that they sort of have this. They're loggerheads over this. You think maybe at some point there might be some sort of peace brokered between the two of them, because they both seem so reasonable. But what do you think he'll change at the NIH, if anything?
Well, we have some indication. I think he gets a lot of attention for COVID, and that's when he gained a national stage. So that's understandable. But the NIH is not the COVID agency of the federal government. It's not. He's not going to be dealing with, fingers crossed, like how to handle another pandemic in terms of how we want to lock down, or how we want to provision our resources. The NIH is a massive, massive agency that's the largest funder of medical and scientific research in the country, and he is a health policy researcher and has written papers about how the NIH needs to fund more aggressive and innovative science. So, I don't think that he is in the style of the Ramaswamis and Musks of the second Trump term. Cut. I think it's going to be a kind of, I hope that we'll see an aggressive spending regime towards, cutting bureaucratic hurdles to publishing science, and being much more transparent in how grants are written and applied for and drafted and ultimately granted. Hopefully that will lead to sort of a more innovative funding regime for medical and health sciences in the country.
Yeah.
He's a longtime critic of the way that the agency works and its inefficiencies and bureaucracies. And I don't think I don't think that means he's, coming in to slash and burn.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing I know about him is he's very dedicated to the topic that you write about. He's a big First Amendment guy. He's down on government censorship. He's become this experience, I think, has turned him into a true believer of the importance of more information, not less information, especially when it comes to big topics like public health. So, Charlie, hey, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been great talking to you. I've been talking to Charlie Tidmarsh. He is the writer at RealClearPolitics. He writes This Week in Censorship. You should check his stuff out. I do every week. I'm Andrew Walworth. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. And that's our show for today. We'll see you next week. Have a good evening.